Between 1810 and 1840, thousands of mountain men ventured into the untamed wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, building shelters with nothing but an axe and raw determination. Their crude cabins, often no bigger than your bedroom, have withstood 2 centuries of brutal winters, while today's million-dollar log mansions rot within a decade. Here's what life was really like for the mountain men who discovered a secret to building that modern architects have forgotten. Before we begin tonight's story, if these help you drift off, I'd love if you left a like or subscribed. It helps me know I'm keeping you good company. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's nice to think of some of you settling in for the night while others might be winding down your afternoon. All right, let's head back to the Rocky Mountains in the 1830s. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously, adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket. Because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. Your eyes snap open to darkness. The air in the tiny cabin is so cold your breath forms a cloud above your face. Outside, the wind howls through the pines, driving snow against the logs just inches from your head. The temperature is somewhere south of 20 below zero. Another brutal January night in the Rocky Mountains. You're probably thinking, no way anyone survived winter in these conditions. But wait, that's the crazy part. Not only did the mountain men survive, but they thrived in tiny cabins that modern builders would laugh at. You untangle yourself from the buffalo robe that's kept you from freezing solid through the night. Unlike your plush duvet right now, this heavy, hairy mass smells like, well, exactly what it is. A dead buffalo that's been scraped, stretched and smoke-tanned. But damn if it isn't warm. Your bare feet hit the dirt floor and you wince, not because it's cold, though it is, but because the ground is actually warmer than you expected, and this is your first clue to the forgotten genius of the mountain man's cabin. Hang on, I can hear you thinking, a dirt floor that isn't freezing in sub-zero temperatures? That doesn't make sense. Welcome to the Trapper's Tilt, a structure so brilliantly designed for survival that it'll make your modern, centrally heated house seem fragile by comparison. The cabin is tiny, 90 square feet, about the size of a modern bathroom. In the dim light filtering through the single oiled paper window, you can see the entire space. There's a small fire pit in the centre with smoke lazily rising toward a hole in the roof. Your bedding area takes up one corner. A few steel traps hang from pegs on the wall. Dried meat dangles from the rafters. That's it. That's the whole place. You know what's wild about this little box of logs? In 2025, it would still be standing while that fancy timber frame vacation home with the cathedral ceiling and massive stone fireplace would be a rotting mess. I'm serious. The cabin you're in right now was built to last centuries, not decades. The mountain man would just laugh and go, "Y'all are building it wrong," and he'd be right. I spent way too long researching how these cabins were constructed, like concerningly long, and what I found blew my mind. These weren't just primitive shelters thrown together by desperate men. They were sophisticated systems that worked with nature instead of fighting against it. Now, get the fire going before you freeze. There's a small pile of kindling next to the fire pit and a larger stack of split logs against one wall. You grab your fire kit, a small leather pouch containing flint, steel and some char cloth. A few strikes of steel against flint send sparks onto the char cloth. A gentle breath and the cloth begins to glow. You transfer this ember to a nest of dried pine needles and within moments you've got flames. The light grows stronger, revealing more details of your surroundings. The log walls aren't squared off like modern cabins, they're round, with the bark still attached in many places, but most shocking is the notching. Modern log homes have these perfect, tight-fitting notches at the bottom of each log. These logs have crude notches chopped into the top. Wait, that can't be right, you think. Wouldn't water collect in those notches and rot the logs? And there it is, the first of the mountain man's secrets that modern builders have forgotten. The enemy wasn't water, it was trapped water. Let me paint you a picture of what's happening in the $1 million log mansion that's currently rotting away in Aspen or Vale. The builder has carefully stripped, shaped and kiln-dried those massive logs. They've meticulously notched them on the bottom, creating perfect joints. Then they've sealed everything with modern chinking, basically caulk on steroids. The place is airtight, just like modern building codes demand. But there's a problem. Logs are alive. They expand and contract with humidity and temperature. They absorb moisture from the air, and when that moisture gets trapped inside an airtight seal, well, that's when the black rot starts. Stay with me here, because this is where it gets weird. The mountain man's cabin isn't failing because it's crude. It's succeeding because it's crude. It's breathing. It's a living system. Oh, and that dirt floor that's weirdly warm, it's acting as thermal mass, storing heat from the fire and radiating it back during the night. The mountain man didn't need to understand physics to know it worked. The fire is crackling nicely now, and the small space begins to warm. You grab a handful of dried meat, stringy, smoky, and tough as leather, and gnaw on it while contemplating the roof. It's unlike any roof you've seen on a modern cabin. Instead of neat shingles or metal panels, it's a layered system. Long poles span from wall to wall, extending about 4 feet beyond the front wall to create a small porch area. On top of those poles are overlapping sheets of cedar bark, and on top of that is dirt and plants. This has to be the worst roof design ever, you might think. It's literally dirt and weeds. Except it's not. It's the second forgotten secret, a living roof that's practically maintenance-free and will last for decades. In the corner, you notice a small pile of items, your mountain man essentials. There's a green river knife, deadly sharp and versatile enough to skin a beaver, whittle a trap trigger, or carve your dinner. Next to it sits your possible bag, a small leather pouch containing fire-starting materials, a few steel fish hooks, and all for repairing leather and a bit of tobacco. Your rifle, a .54 caliber Hawken, leans against the wall, wrapped in an oiled cloth to protect it from the damp. That rifle represents about a year's wages for a labourer back east. Out here, it's worth its weight in gold beaver pelts. I mean, imagine your entire survival depending on one tool that you can't replace. Like, if your iPhone breaks, you get a new one. If this rifle breaks 200 miles from the nearest trading post, well, hope you remember how to make snares. The guard's like, "You can't bring that gun in here, it's too big." And the mountain man goes, "It's not a gun, it's my dinner maker, my protector, and my best friend." In your head, you're thinking, there's no way this tiny box keeps me alive through winter. Spoiler, it absolutely can. Outside, the wind picks up, howling through the pines and rattling the crude door. But inside, despite the simplicity, you're relatively comfortable. The small space heats quickly. The dirt floor radiates warmth. The buffalo robe provides better insulation than any modern sleeping bag. And most importantly, the cabin itself, this primitive structure, is working with the environment, not against it. What did a half-literate mountain man know that our best architects have forgotten? They understood that a log cabin is not just a house, it's a living organism. Modern log homes fail because they're built like sealed boxes, fighting against nature's forces. The mountain man's cabin succeeds because it's built to breathe, shift, and adapt. It's not static. It's dynamic. It changes with the seasons. It expands and contracts. It lets moisture in, then lets it out again. The fat ends of the logs are all placed toward the front of the cabin, creating a slight upward tilt to the roof. It's not much, just enough to shed water and snow, but it's perfect for the living roof system that keeps you dry. Consider the modern approach. Complicated gable roofs that require precise cutting and fitting. The mountain man's approach? Simple, tilted, effective. There are no nails in this cabin, no metal fasteners at all, except for perhaps a door hinge. Everything is held together by gravity, by the careful placement of logs, by the ingenious top-notch system that modern builders would scoff at. The trapper's tilt wasn't some accident of primitive construction. It was a sophisticated response to a harsh environment, developed through trial and error in conditions that would kill most modern outdoorsmen in days. Oh, and that strange, musty smell filling your fancy $1 million log palace? That's black mold eating away at your investment. The only smell in the mountain man's cabin is wood smoke, leather, and maybe a bit of unwashed trapper, but the structure itself is dry, solid, and built to last another century. As the light grows stronger, you pull on your buckskin leggings and shirt. Unlike modern outdoor gear that needs replacing every few years, these clothes are nearly indestructible. The shirt's seams are fringed with strips of leather, not for decoration, but so you have emergency cordage if needed. Every aspect of mountain man life is practical, dual purpose, and efficient. You run your hand along one of the wall logs, feeling the rough bark and the crude notch. Modern builders would be horrified by these green, unseasoned logs, but the mountain man knew something they've forgotten. As these logs dried, they would shrink and tighten, making the structure stronger over time. He was building with time, not against it. The snow has stopped now, and thin winter sunlight streams through the oiled paper window. It's time to check your traps, the real reason you're out here in this frozen wilderness. The beaver pelts you collect will end up as fashionable top hats in London and Paris, earning you enough to live like a king for a few months during the summer rendezvous. But before you head out into the brutal cold, take one more look around this tiny, primitive shelter. It's going to keep you alive through temperatures that would freeze your modern car's engine solid. It's going to stand for nearly 2 centuries after you're gone. And it's built with a wisdom that modern builders, with all their technology and engineering degrees, have somehow lost. The forgotten knowledge of the mountain man wasn't just about survival, it was about understanding that we succeed not by conquering nature, but by working with it. You pull on your fur cap, wrap a wool scarf around your face, and push open the crude door. The blast of cold air takes your breath away. Another day in the life of a mountain man begins, a life harsh beyond imagination, but also filled with a freedom and self-reliance that's almost impossible to find in today's world. And as you step out into the pristine snow, you can't help but wonder, what other wisdom have we forgotten in our rush to improve upon the past? The cold bites at your face, the brutal reality of mountain life, making itself known with every breath. But that little cabin, that perfect, breathing, living system will be waiting for you when you return. Warm, dry, and built to outlast almost anything modern man can create. Unlike your cozy bed right now, with its perfect temperature and fluffy pillows, survival out here isn't guaranteed. It's earned through knowledge, through respect for the environment, and through building systems that work with nature rather than against it. The mountain men weren't just survivors, they were engineers, architects and scientists who never went to school, and the knowledge they discovered, then passed down through generations, is now largely lost, replaced by building codes and modern materials that often fail to match the performance of these primitive techniques. but that knowledge isn't completely gone. It's still there in the remaining trappers' tilts, scattered throughout the Rockies, standing after nearly 2 centuries, silently testifying to the genius of their builders. And now you know the first secret. The cabin is alive. It breathes. It adapts. It works with the forces of nature rather than fighting them. But this living system had vulnerabilities. One mistake in the design, one flaw in the execution, and the entire structure could become a waterlogged death trap. And that's where we'll go next, into the details of exactly how these remarkable shelters were built, starting with the most controversial technique of all, the top notch. The bitter cold bites into your fingers as you work the steel trap. Setting beaver traps in January is a special kind of misery. The water's so cold it burns, numbing your hands within seconds. But the pelts are prime in winter, and prime pelts mean good money at the rendezvous. You've been working this valley for 3 months now, built your tilt in just 5 days back in October, right before the first serious snow. Most folks back east wouldn't believe that. 5 days to build an entire cabin, but that's another piece of forgotten knowledge. Speed wasn't just convenient, it was survival. When you're alone in these mountains, every hour counts. Waste time on fancy joinery or perfect corners, and winter catches you sleeping under pine boughs instead of inside a solid shelter. That's why the top notch was so damn important. Modern builders would have a conniption fit if they saw how you notched these logs. You put the notch where? I can hear them asking now. The thing is, if you ask any respectable log home builder today about notching, they'll talk about saddle notches, dovetail notches, and fancy scribing techniques. They'll tell you the notches must be on the bottom of the log to shed water. They'll say it's a painstaking process that demands skill, precision, and expensive tools, and they're not wrong for their type of construction. But a mountain man would have looked at all that fuss and just laughed. Your hands are nearly useless now, the cold turning your fingers into clumsy sticks. You trigger the trap, set it carefully in the stream where a beaver's path is worn into the bank, and camouflage it with mud and twigs. 1 down, 5 more to go. You think about your cabin while you work. The secret that nobody talks about nowadays is this. The mountain man notched his logs on the top, not the bottom. Heresy, according to modern builders. A notch on top is a water trap, they'd say, a perfect place for moisture to collect and rot to begin. But this assumes you're trying to build a sealed system. The mountain man knew better. He understood the enemy wasn't water, it was trapped water. The whole cabin system was designed to breathe, to allow moisture to escape. The top notch wasn't a mistake or a shortcut. It was a calculated risk, a trade-off for speed and efficiency, and it paid off because it was part of a complete system. Let me walk you through how a mountain man like you would have built that cabin back in 1830. Picture this. It's early October. Winter's coming. You've found a good spot near a stream with plenty of beaver sign. There's a small clearing surrounded by straight lodgepole pines. Perfect building material. First, you'd find 2 fallen logs for your sill logs, the foundation. If none were available, you'd chop down 2 trees, no concrete pad, no gravel base, nothing fancy, just 2 logs laid directly on the ground or half buried in the earth for stability. Wait, directly on the ground. Without a foundation, modern builders would be horrified. That'll rot within a year, they'd protest. Except it doesn't, because those sill logs were usually cedar or another naturally rot-resistant wood, and because the whole system was designed to breathe and adapt. Next, you'd cut enough logs for your walls. For a standard 10x9 foot trapper's tilt, that's about 40-50 logs, depending on their diameter. Using just an axe, a good Green River trade axe weighing about 3 pounds, you could fell a 30-foot pine in under 20 minutes. Hang on, you might be thinking. Wouldn't those logs need to dry and cure for months before building? Nope. And that's the next piece of forgotten knowledge. Mountain men used green, unseasoned logs, often with the bark still on. Modern builders would consider this amateur hour. Green logs will shrink, warp, and crack as they dry, they'd warn. And they're right. The logs do shrink and settle as they dry, but that's not a bug. It's a feature. The mountain man knew that as green logs dried, they'd shrink and settle, actually tightening the structure over time. He wasn't fighting this natural process. He was using it to his advantage. Your second trap is set now, the cold making every movement painful. 4 more to go. Your thoughts drift back to how quickly that cabin came together. The most ingenious part was the top-notching technique. It allowed you to log up with incredible speed. A skilled woodsman, and after a season in the mountains, you became very skilled, could chop a notch in a green cedar log in just 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Let that sink in. You could set an entire log in place in about 12 minutes. The whole cabin could be walled up in a matter of days, not weeks. The process was brutally simple. Mark the width of the notch on the top of the log. With a sharp axe, chop a notch halfway through. Sometimes drive a long nail or wooden peg through the notch into the log below as a temporary clamp. Cut the notch on the other side, then roll the top log into place. No measuring, no scribing, no complex joinery. Just a man, an axe, and a deep understanding of wood. Modern log home construction is like building a piece of furniture, precise, measured, deliberate. Mountain man construction was more like carving a tool in an emergency, fast, functional, good enough. The cold is really setting in now. The sun hides behind grey clouds, and your breath hangs in the air like smoke. As you move to your third trap site, you realise your feet are going numb too. Winter in the Rockies doesn't just kill the careless, it erases them completely. That speed of construction wasn't a shortcut or a compromise, it was survival. Building a trapper's tilt was a race against time. A man alone in the wilderness didn't have weeks to spend scribing and fitting logs. He needed shelter, and he needed it now. The walls go up fast using top notching, but what about the roof? That's where things get even more interesting. Modern cabin roofs involve trusses, rafters, sheathing, felt paper, and shingles. It's complicated carpentry requiring specialised tools. The mountain man's approach, simpler and arguably more effective for his environment. Remember how all the fat ends of the logs are placed toward the front of the cabin. This naturally creates a slight upward tilt from back to front. It's not much, maybe a 15 to 20 degree slope, but it's enough to shed rain and snow. That slight angle is perfect for the simplest roof design, the shed roof. No complex gable ends, no tricky corners, just a single slope from front to back or back to front. Your third trap is now set, half your day's work done. The skin on your fingers is cracking from repeated exposure to the icy water. You'll pay for this work tonight with aching joints and burning skin, but beaver pelts are worth $6 each at Rendezvous, a small fortune when you can collect 200-300 over a season. You think about the finished cabin as you work. After the walls were up, the roof went on with similar speed. First, a layer of long, slender poles, usually tamarack or lodgepole pine, laid across the top of the walls. These poles extended about 4 feet over the front, creating a small porch area that kept snow away from the entrance. Then sheets of cedar bark were laid over the poles, overlapping like shingles. The bark was peeled in late spring when the sap was running, and it came off the trees in large, flexible sheets. It formed a natural waterproof membrane, and it was free for the taking. But here's where mountain men really showed their genius. The final layer was a thick blanket of sod, dirt, and moss. Several inches thick, it served multiple purposes. It held the bark in place, protected it from wind, provided massive insulation, and most importantly, acted like a giant sponge. That living roof absorbed rainwater and released it slowly, preventing it from ever reaching the logs below. It wasn't fighting water, it was managing it. Or wait, I hear you thinking, dirt on the roof? Wouldn't that just wash away in the first rainstorm? Nope, because it wasn't just dirt, it was sod, living plants with roots that held everything together. And those plants weren't just passengers, they were part of the system. As they grew, their roots strengthened the roof. By the second season, that roof was practically self-healing. Your fourth trap is set, your hands now so numb you can barely manipulate the springs. 2 more to go, the temperature seems to be dropping further, and you notice snow clouds building to the west. Need to finish quickly. Modern builders think of a roof as a barrier, something to keep water out. The mountain man thought of his roof as a system to manage water, not to block it completely, but to control how it interacted with the structure. Think about it. How many modern homes have leaky roofs just a few years after construction? How many need regular maintenance and repairs? The trapper's tilt, with its primitive living roof, could go decades with minimal attention. By trap number 5, you're moving purely on muscle memory. Fingers don't work right when they're this cold. Every mountain man knows the danger. Frostbite can cost you digits or limbs out here hundreds of miles from any doctor. You've seen old-timers at rendezvous with missing fingers, toes, even noses lost to the brutal cold. It's a high price to pay for beaver pelts, but the mountains call to a certain kind of person, the kind who values freedom above comfort, independence above safety. Back to the cabin construction. With walls up and roof on, what about the gaps between logs? This is where chinking comes in. Modern chinking is basically specialised cork, a flexible synthetic compound that seals gaps completely. The mountain man's chinking, a mixture of clay, sand and dried grass, sometimes with lime or animal hair mixed in for strength. Again, modern builders would scoff. That'll crack and fall out with the first freeze-thaw cycle, they'd argue, and again, they'd be missing the point. The primitive chinking wasn't meant to be a perfect seal. It was designed to be a permeable membrane, a part of the living, breathing skin of the cabin. It allowed trapped moisture to escape while keeping the worst of the weather out. This is the third key to the forgotten knowledge. Breathable walls. A modern airtight cabin is ironically a death trap for logs. It traps moisture inside, creating the perfect environment for rot and decay. Your final trap is set as the first snowflakes begin to fall. Perfect timing. You head back toward your cabin, body aching, hands and feet throbbing as blood begins to return to your extremities. This life isn't for everyone. It's brutal, lonely, and unforgiving, but there's something pure about it too. No boss breathing down your neck, no social obligations, no keeping up with the Joneses, just you, your skills and nature, sometimes working with you, often working against you. As your cabin comes into view, smoke curling from the smoke hole in the roof, you appreciate again how perfect this simple structure is for this environment. Not despite its crude construction, but because of it. Take the door, for example. In a modern home, doors are complex assemblies of frame, panel, hinges, and hardware. The mountain man's door, often just a few boards or small logs lashed together with rawhide hanging on crude wooden hinges or leather straps. Sounds drafty, you might think, and it was, but that was addressed with a buffalo robe hung on the inside during the coldest months. The robe could be adjusted based on weather and need for ventilation. Actually, here's something the old-timer who taught you cabin building said: "A cabin that don't breathe is like a man who can't breathe, dead before its time. You push open the crude door, grateful to be out of the wind. The interior is cool but not freezing. The dirt floor has retained heat from this morning's fire, another aspect of the living system. A modern concrete pad would be ice cold. This natural earth acts as thermal mass, storing and slowly releasing heat. You add wood to the fire, build it up to a good blaze. Your fingers ache as they warm, the pain of circulation returning worse than the cold itself. That's the price you pay for walking this path. Freedom isn't free, not even in these mountains. Looking around your small shelter, you see nothing that would impress a modern person. No fancy fixtures, no decorative touches, just function, survival, efficiency. But there's beauty in that simplicity, a harmony with the environment that modern construction has largely lost. You hang your wet mittens near the fire and set your wet moccasins nearby to dry. Moisture management isn't just about the cabin, it's about everything in mountain life. Wet equals dead when temperatures drop far below freezing. Outside, the snow is falling harder now. Another storm moving in. But you're not worried. This small shelter, built with techniques now mostly forgotten, will keep you alive through whatever the mountains throw at you. A modern builder would look at this cabin and see only what's missing. No foundation, no vapor barrier, no manufactured materials, but what's present is far more important. A deep understanding of how to work with natural materials and natural processes. The fire's really going now, warming the small space quickly. You check your supplies, got enough meat jerky and pemmican to last through a week-long storm if needed. Water's easy, just melt snow. You're self-sufficient in a way few modern people can imagine. The beauty of the trapper's tilt isn't just that it's quick to build or that it lasts for decades, it's that it requires almost no specialized materials. Everything you need can be harvested within a few hundred yards of the building site. Try doing that with a modern home. As the daylight fades, you light a small tallow candle, rendered from bear fat last fall. Its light flickers on the rough log walls, casting moving shadows. There's peace in this simplicity. You unwrap your most prized possession, the Hawken rifle, and begin the evening ritual of cleaning and oiling it. Out here, a functional rifle means eating and protection. A malfunctioning one might mean death. The care you give this tool mirrors the thought that went into your shelter. Nothing fancy, nothing excessive. Just what works, what lasts, what serves its purpose efficiently. Speaking of which, that little slope in your roof created by placing the fat ends of the logs toward the front, that's not just good for drainage, it creates a natural draft that pulls smoke up and out of the cabin. No complex chimney required. It's getting dark now, another long winter night beginning. By modern standards, this existence is harsh beyond imagining. No running water, no electricity, no convenience foods or entertainment, but there's something to be said for the direct connection to survival. Every action has immediate consequences. Every skill directly contributes to staying alive. You check the chinking between a few logs, noting where it might need repair come spring. The mixture of clay, sand and grass fibres has hardened nicely, filling the larger gaps while still allowing the wood to breathe. In a few places, frost has formed around the edges, not a sign of failure, but evidence that moisture is escaping rather than getting trapped in the logs. The wind picks up outside, howling through the pines and rattling your door, but inside it's surprisingly comfortable, not warm by modern standards, but survivable. And in the mountains in winter, that's all that matters. The design choices that went into this cabin weren't random or simply primitive. They were solutions evolved through harsh trial and error in conditions where mistakes meant death. What seems crude to modern eyes is actually sophisticated in its simplicity, effective in its execution, and remarkably durable over time. As you settle in for the night, pulling the buffalo robe around you, you can't help but feel a certain pride. Not everyone could survive out here. Not everyone could build a structure that withstands these conditions with such basic tools and materials. The knowledge you're using wasn't learned in schools or from books. It was passed from trapper to trapper, refined through bitter experience, and proven in the harshest testing ground of all, winter in the Rocky Mountains. Modern builders have forgotten much of this wisdom, replacing it with engineered solutions that often fail to match the elegant simplicity of what you're experiencing now. The top notch, the green logs, the living roof, the breathable chinking, the slight tilt to the walls, each element alone might seem primitive or flawed. Together they form a living system that works with nature rather than against it. As your eyes grow heavy, the fire burning down to coals, you drift towards sleep, knowing that while this life is hard, you've mastered something profound, the ability to create shelter that truly belongs in this landscape, built with the mountain's own materials, designed to move and breathe with the seasons. And that knowledge, the forgotten wisdom of the mountain man, has kept you alive for another day in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Morning arrives with brutal clarity in the mountains. No gentle dawn here, just sudden knife-edge cold and blinding light reflecting off fresh snow. You push aside the buffalo robe and face another day of survival. Last night's storm dumped nearly a foot of fresh powder. Your traps are buried somewhere beneath it. Finding them will consume most of the day, but first you need to check on something even more important: your roof. You step outside, squinting against the glare. The temperature must be 20 below. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe, freezing the hairs in your nostrils with each inhale. But your attention is on the roof of your trapper's tilt. Snow blankets it completely, at least 18 inches deep in places. To a modern homeowner, this would be cause for panic. The weight, the potential leaks, the structural stress. But you're not worried. In fact, you're pleased. That's just more insulation, the old mountain man who taught you would say, and he was right. The living roof of the trapper's tilt, that layer of poles, bark, sod and moss, was designed to carry this load. More importantly, it was designed to use it. Snow is an excellent insulator. The thick blanket on your roof is actually making your cabin warmer, creating a barrier between you and the brutal sky. I once asked a cabin restoration expert about these roofs. They seem primitive, he told me, until you realize they're actually more advanced than what we typically build today. See, a modern roof is primarily a water barrier. A mountain man's roof was a complete environmental management system. The design wasn't just about keeping precipitation out, it was about thermal regulation, moisture control, fire resistance, and durability with minimal maintenance. Let's take a closer look at this forgotten technology. Picture the layers. First, those long, slender poles, usually tamarack or lodgepole pine, laid side by side across the top of the walls. They weren't uniform or perfectly straight. They didn't need to be. They just needed to create a framework strong enough to support the next layers. One mountain man's diary entry from 1832 reads, "Spent the day cutting poles for the roof. Found a stand of young tamarack that will serve admirably. A man could do worse than tamarack, strong for its weight and resists rot better than most." Over these poles went sheets of cedar bark, overlapping like shingles. This wasn't the rigid, brittle bark you might imagine. When harvested in late spring, when the sap is running, cedar bark comes off in large, flexible sheets. It's naturally water-resistant and surprisingly durable. The timing was crucial. Try to peel bark in winter and you'll struggle to get anything usable. But in spring, a skilled hand could strip enough bark for an entire cabin roof in just a day. You brush some snow off a corner of your roof, revealing a glimpse of the final layer, that living blanket of sod, dirt and moss that made these roofs so effective. This is where modern builders really miss the point. They see dirt and think, how primitive, how crude. What they're missing is the sophisticated ecosystem at work. The sod layer, several inches thick, served multiple purposes. It held the bark shingles in place, protecting them from wind. It provided massive insulation, keeping the cabin warmer in winter and cooler in summer, and most importantly, it acted as a giant sponge. During rainstorms, that layer of earth and vegetation absorbed water, then released it slowly through evaporation. Rather than trying to create a perfect barrier, which inevitably fails eventually, the mountain man created a management system that worked with the natural behavior of water. But wouldn't dirt wash away in heavy rain, you might ask? Not if it's living sod. The roots of grasses and small plants quickly formed a cohesive mat. By the second season, wildflowers and grasses were often growing on the roof, further strengthening the system. Some tilts even sprouted small shrubs after a few years. You've heard stories of old, abandoned cabins discovered decades later with fully established gardens growing on their roofs. The structure becomes part of the landscape rather than fighting against it. As you shake off the morning chill and build up the fire, you notice a small leak in one corner where water is dripping from a melting icicle that's formed inside. In a modern home, this would be disaster, a sign of failure requiring immediate repair. But in the trapper's tilt, it's just part of the cycle. The small amount of water that makes it through will either evaporate in the warmth of your fire or be absorbed by the dirt floor. By tomorrow, there will be no sign it ever happened. The mountain man understood something profound. Perfection is the enemy of durability. Systems that can't flex break. Systems that can't leak eventually burst. Systems that can't breathe suffocate. With your fire crackling nicely, you pull on your gear and prepare to check your traps. Time to face that brutal cold again. But before you go, you inspect the chinking between the logs. Modern chinking is basically cork, a synthetic barrier designed to create an airtight seal. The mountain man's chinking was a mixture of mud, clay, sand and dried grass or animal hair, materials available anywhere you might build. My grandmother would have called it cob, an old-timer, at the last rendezvous, told you. Same stuff they built houses with in the old country, lasts for centuries if you do it right. The mixture varies from region to region, builder to builder. Some used more clay for a harder set. Others preferred a sandier mix that remained somewhat flexible. In areas with limestone, a bit of lime might be added to help it set. What made this chinking special wasn't its composition, but its function. It wasn't designed as an airtight seal. It was a permeable membrane, part of the living, breathing skin of the cabin. When humidity was high, the clay absorbed some moisture. When the air dried, that moisture was released. This constant exchange prevented the logs from rotting, the primary cause of failure in modern log structures. You push open the door and step into the shocking cold. Your breath instantly forms a cloud that's whisked away by the wind. Time to find those traps under all this fresh snow. Hours later, you return with 3 beaver pelts. Not bad considering how difficult it was to locate the traps. You're half frozen, fingers and toes numb, despite your best efforts to stay warm. The mountains extract a price for every pelt. Inside your tilt, the transformation is immediate. It's not exactly warm by modern standards, but compared to the killing cold outside, it feels like a furnace. Your small fire has kept the space survivable, and the cabin's design has retained that precious heat. You hang the fresh pelts on the wall. They'll need to be properly fleshed and stretched later, but right now you need to warm up before your extremities suffer permanent damage. As feeling painfully returns to your fingers, you contemplate the pelts. Each one represents about $6 at the summer rendezvous. A good trapper might collect 200, 300 in a season, enough to live like a king for months, but the mountain exacts payment in pain, risk, and isolation. Is it worth it? A newcomer asked you last summer, watching you spend your hard-earned money on whiskey and supplies. You didn't answer then. The question seemed to miss the point. The mountain men weren't here just for money. They were here for freedom, for the challenge, for a life unbounded by society's constraints. As evening approaches, you prepare a simple meal, pemmican with a handful of dried berries mixed in for variety. The pemmican is your own make, rendered fat mixed with dried, pounded meat and berries. It's calorie-dense and keeps through the winter without spoiling. A handful contains enough energy for hours of hard work in the cold. Your body warmed and hunger satisfied, you turn your attention to the pelts. Each needs to be stretched on a willow hoop frame to dry properly. It's meticulous work, but your hands know it well after years in the mountains. While you work, a sound catches your attention. A faint creak from the roof. The cabin is talking to you. Modern buildings are silent, or at least they're supposed to be. Creaks, shifts and groans are seen as flaws, but the trapper's tilt is different. It's alive, responding to temperature changes, snow load, wind pressure. That creak isn't failure, it's adaptation. The living structure is shifting slightly under the weight of snow, finding a new equilibrium. By morning it will have adjusted completely. This constant, subtle movement is why the crude top-notching and green logs work. The structure isn't fighting natural forces, it's yielding to them, accommodating them, then returning to form when they pass. You finish with the pelts and hang them where they'll catch the heat from the fire without scorching. By morning, they'll be ready for proper stretching on the frames. Night falls early in winter. By 5 o'clock, darkness is complete. Your candle casts flickering shadows on the rough log walls as you attend to small tasks, mending a torn moccasin, whittling new triggers for your traps, taking inventory of your supplies. It's during these quiet evening hours that the true value of the trapper's tilt becomes most apparent. Outside, the temperature plummets to 30 below. The wind rises, driving snow through the pine branches with a sound like distant surf. These conditions kill. They kill quickly and without mercy. But inside your crude shelter, life continues, not in comfort by modern standards, but in security. The fire's warmth, the buffalo robe's insulation, the cabin's protection from wind and snow, together they form a bubble of survival in a hostile world. The old mountain man who taught you cabin building had a saying, "The difference between living and dying out here ain't how fancy your shelter is, it's how well it works with what the mountain throws at it." Modern buildings fight the elements. They try to create perfect barriers against heat, cold, moisture, and they fail. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but inevitably, because nothing man-made can permanently resist nature. The trapper's tilt doesn't fight. It accommodates. It flexes, breathes, adapts. It's built with an understanding that perfection is impossible, so resilience becomes the goal instead. As you prepare for sleep, banking the fire to last through the night, you run your hand along one of the wall logs. Beneath the rough bark, you can almost feel the life still present in the wood. These trees aren't truly dead. They've just been repurposed. Their natural properties, insulation, strength, resilience, continue to serve now as your shelter rather than as living plants. This connection to the natural world is something modern construction has largely lost. We've forgotten that we don't need to conquer nature to survive within it. Sometimes working with its forces is far more effective than working against them. You wrap yourself in the buffalo robe, positioning yourself near the banked coals of the fire. Sleep comes quickly after a day of physical labor in the cold. Your last thought before drifting off is appreciation for this simple shelter, this living system that keeps death at bay in one of Earth's harshest environments. Morning brings new challenges. The temperature has risen slightly, causing the snow on your roof to begin melting. In a modern house, this would mean potential ice dams, leaks, structural damage. For your trapper's tilt, it's just another day in the seasonal cycle. As the snow melts, water percolates through the sod layer, where much of it is absorbed. Some makes its way to the bark layer, where it either runs off or is directed to the edges by the slight slope of the roof. A small amount might find its way through, creating minor drips inside, but the dirt floor simply absorbs this moisture, completing the cycle. After a breakfast of jerky and coffee, real coffee is a luxury in the mountains, saved for the coldest mornings when you need the boost. You head out to check your traps again. The day brings mixed results. 2 beavers, but one was partially eaten by a wolverine before you arrived. The mountains give and take with equal indifference. By mid-afternoon, clouds build on the western horizon. Another storm approaches. You can feel it in the changing pressure, see it in the way the light shifts. Time to head back to the tilt. You arrive just as the first snowflakes begin to fall. Inside, you build up the fire and prepare for another evening of isolation as the storm rages outside. This is when you notice something remarkable about your shelter. As the barometric pressure drops with the approaching storm, the entire cabin seems to exhale. Tiny gaps appear in the chinking as the logs shift slightly. The structure is responding to changing conditions, just as a living organism would. When the storm hits full force, wind howling and snow driving horizontally, those same gaps will close up as the logs shift again under pressure. It's a constant, subtle dance of adjustment that no modern building can match. This is the true secret of the trapper's tilt. Not any single technique like the top notch or the living roof, but the integration of all these elements into a complete system that breathes, flexes, and adapts. Modern builders have forgotten this holistic approach. They focus on individual components, better waterproofing, stronger fasteners, more efficient insulation, without understanding how these elements interact as a system. The storm arrives with full fury just after sunset. Wind screams through the pine forest, driving snow through any gap it can find. Inside, your fire flickers from the draft, but the cabin holds firm. You've survived worse. As you settle in for another night, your thoughts drift to the rendezvous next summer. For a few chaotic weeks, mountain men from across the Rockies will gather to trade furs, resupply, share information, and blow off steam after months of isolation. You'll trade your carefully collected beaver pelts for coffee, tobacco, lead for bullets, new traps to replace broken ones. You'll drink whiskey, gamble, swap tall tales, and maybe find a companion for a time. Then you'll return to the high country, to the solitude, to the simple honesty of survival, and you'll build another cabin using these forgotten techniques that have kept you alive through Rocky Mountain winters that would kill most modern outdoorsmen within days. The mountain man's legacy isn't just the trails he blazed or the territories he explored, it's also this practical wisdom, this deep understanding of how to create structures that work with nature rather than against it. As the storm rages outside and your fire burns low, you drift towards sleep, secure in your knowledge of these forgotten secrets. The top notch, the green logs, the living roof, the breathable chinking, separate, they might seem primitive. Together, they form one of the most sophisticated shelter systems ever devised. And as modern log homes continue to rot while the few remaining trapper tilts stand firm after nearly 2 centuries, perhaps it's time to reconsider which approach was truly advanced and which was primitive. The wind moans around the corners of your cabin, searching for weakness but finding none. The snow piles deeper, adding its insulating layer to your living roof. Inside, wrapped in buffalo hide with the last embers of your fire casting a faint glow, you sleep peacefully in your breathing, adapting shelter. This harmony with nature, building with it rather than against it, is perhaps the most valuable forgotten knowledge of all. February in the Rockies, the cruelest month. You've been in this valley for nearly 4 months now, with another month or so before the spring thaw begins. Your beard has grown wild, your skin has turned leathery from wind and smoke, and your body has adapted to perpetual cold. You've become something between man and animal, a creature of pure survival. Morning begins the same way it has for weeks. You emerge from your buffalo robe, teeth chattering despite sleeping fully clothed except for your moccasins. The fire died during the night, leaving only grey ash and a few faintly glowing coals. The temperature inside the cabin has dropped to just above freezing, cold enough to see your breath, but warm enough to keep water from turning to ice. That's the magic of the trapper's tilt, even without active heating. First thing you do when you wake up is make fire, old Williams told you when you first came to the mountains. Do it before you piss, before you stretch, before you think about breakfast. Fire first, everything else second. Smart advice. You kneel before the fire pit, arranging kindling over the coals, then blowing gently until flames appear. The routine is so ingrained you could do it blindfolded. While the fire builds, you take stock of your living situation. After months in this 9x10 foot space, you know every inch intimately. Your beaver traps hang from pegs on one wall. Your rifle rests in the corner nearest your sleeping spot. Snowshoes hang beside the door. Meat and pemmican are stored in leather bags suspended from the rafters to keep them away from mice. You've created small luxuries over time, a 3-legged stool made from a log section and pine branches, a crude table from split logs, shelves made from notched sticks driven between logs in the wall. These small comforts make the isolation more bearable. The cabin itself has changed subtly since you built it. The green logs have begun to dry and shrink, tightening the structure. You've had to add chinking in places where gaps appeared. The dirt floor has compacted from use, creating a smooth, hard surface that's surprisingly easy to keep clean with a pine branch broom. By modern standards, it's primitive beyond imagination. No running water, no bathroom, no electricity, but it's perfectly adapted to its purpose, keeping you alive through a Rocky Mountain winter. The fire's burning well now, pushing back the cold. You pull on your moccasins and head outside to gather more firewood from your steadily diminishing pile. The snow has stopped, revealing a bluebird day with temperatures well below 0, the kind of cold that freezes exposed skin in minutes. Back inside, you melt snow for water and prepare a breakfast of pemmican with a handful of dried service berries mixed in. The berries are a treasure, gathered last summer and carefully dried for winter use. Their tartness cuts through the richness of the pemmican, offering a welcome change to your monotonous diet. Jesus, do you guys just eat meat all the time? A greenhorn asked at last year's rendezvous, watching you tear into a buffalo steak. What else is there? Another trapper replied, genuinely confused by the question. The diet of a mountain man was heavily meat-based, especially in winter. Pemmican, jerky, fresh game when available. In summer, you'd supplement with berries, roots, and plants learned from watching local Indian tribes. But winter was meat, and more meat. Your body adapted, burning fat for energy in the constant cold. After breakfast, it's time to check the traps again, but first, maintenance. Everything in mountain life requires constant upkeep. Your rifle, your traps, your moccasins, your cabin. Neglect means death. You notice a spot where snow has begun to melt through the roof, creating a small drip near one wall. In a modern home, this would be a crisis requiring immediate professional repair. In your trapper's tilt, it's a minor issue easily fixed. You climb onto the table and reach up to the spot where water is coming through. The bark layer has shifted slightly, creating a small gap. You grab a handful of the moss and grass mixture that's part of your chinking material, kept in a corner for repairs, and stuff it into the gap from below. Problem solved. This adaptability, the ability to make quick, effective repairs with materials at hand, is another advantage of the primitive construction. No special tools or materials needed, no expensive contractors, just simple solutions that work. With the leak fixed and your gear checked, you head out for another day of trap checking. The life of a mountain man follows the rhythms of necessity rather than the clock. You work until the work is done, rest when rest is needed, and keep a constant eye on the weather, which can turn deadly within hours. By mid-afternoon, you return with 2 more beaver pelts. Not a great haul, but every pelt means money at the rendezvous. You're up to nearly 120 for the season, a respectable number that should fetch close to $700, enough to buy supplies for next year and enjoy some luxuries during your time back in civilization. As you prepare the new pelts, scraping them clean of fat and flesh with your skinning knife, your thoughts drift to the community you're a part of, despite this solitary existence. The popular image of the mountain man is a lone wolf, completely isolated from human contact. The reality was more complicated. While you might go months without seeing another person during winter, mountain men formed a tight-knit community connected by shared knowledge, experiences, and the annual rendezvous. You learned to build your trapper's tilt not from a book or formal training, but from older trappers who passed down their hard-won knowledge. The top-notch technique, the living roof system, the breathable chinking, all these were shared from man to man, refined through harsh experience. You think you invented this? Old Bridger laughed when a greenhorn boasted about his cabin-building skills. Indians were doing this before your granddaddy was born. We just stole the good ideas and added a few of our own. That was the truth of it. Much of what passed for mountain man wisdom was actually adapted from native techniques, modified to suit European tools and purposes. The mountain men were practical above all else. They used what worked, regardless of its origin. Evening approaches as you finish with the pelts. Time for the daily ritual of securing the cabin for night. You bring in extra firewood, enough to last until morning. You check the door to ensure it's tightly closed. You prepare kindling for tomorrow's fire. These small tasks mean the difference between comfort and misery, sometimes between life and death. Dinner is similar to breakfast. Pemmican again, this time mixed with a handful of parched corn kernels traded from a crow hunter last fall. Luxury in the mountains comes in small packages. As you eat, you notice how the cabin has begun to take on your smell, your essence. The logs are darkened with smoke, the dirt floor compacted by your footsteps, the very air infused with months of occupation. The structure has become an extension of yourself, as personal as your clothing or your rifle. This intimate connection between shelter and occupant is something modern housing has largely lost. People today switch homes like changing clothes, never developing the deep relationship that comes from building your own shelter and adapting it over time. With darkness falling early, you have hours to fill before sleep. Modern people, accustomed to constant entertainment, would go mad with boredom. But you've developed the patience that mountain life requires. You spend the evening on small tasks, mending a tear in your buckskin shirt, carving a new handle for your skinning knife, checking your supply of lead balls for your rifle. Work is never truly done. It just changes form as needed. How do you stand the boredom? A young trapper asked you last summer. Ain't boring if it keeps you alive, you answered simply. That's the mountain man philosophy in a nutshell. Practical, focused on survival, finding purpose in necessity rather than distraction. As you work, you think about the other trappers scattered across these mountains. Jenkins might be 40 miles north in the next valley. Francois and his flathead wife are probably camped near the big lake to the west. Old Williams is likely holed up in his permanent cabin near the trading post. Though separated by vast distances, you're connected by shared experience. Come summer, you'll gather at rendezvous, sharing stories of winter hardships, comparing pelts and profits, drinking and fighting and cementing the bonds that this harsh life creates. Fatigue eventually overtakes you. You bank the fire carefully. Not too much fuel, which would waste wood, but enough to keep coals alive until morning. Then you wrap yourself in the buffalo robe and settle onto your bed of pine boughs covered with a wool blanket. It's not memory foam, but your body has adapted to it. After a day of physical labour in the cold, sleep comes quickly, regardless of comfort. Morning brings unexpected warmth. A Chinook wind has blown in overnight, raising temperatures by 40 degrees. These dramatic swings are common in the Rockies, brief respites from winter's grip that can be both blessing and curse. The sudden warmth means melting snow, which tests your cabin's water management system. The living roof absorbs the meltwater, while the slight tilt of the structure directs runoff away from the foundation logs. Modern cabins often suffer during these thaws, with ice dams forming on roofs and meltwater finding its way into walls. Your primitive shelter handles it with ease. You use the warmer weather to perform tasks that are difficult in deep cold, chopping extra firewood, making repairs to external elements of the cabin, even washing your spare clothing in the partially thawed stream. By mid-morning you've checked half your trap line. The warm spell has made the beavers more active, and you collect 4 pelts. A good day by any standard. Returning to your cabin, you notice something that would shock modern sensibilities. Small mushrooms and moss growing in one corner where the logs meet the dirt floor. In today's world, this would be seen as a problem. Mold, fungus. Call the remediation experts immediately. But to a mountain man, this isn't a flaw, it's part of the living system. The small amount of moisture that enters is processed by these organisms, which help prevent the logs from rotting. It's nature's own maintenance crew, working in harmony with your shelter, rather than being treated as an invader. This small detail illustrates the fundamental difference between modern and mountain man approaches to building. Modern construction tries to create perfect, sterile environments completely separated from nature. The mountain man created permeable boundaries that worked with natural processes. The warm spell lasts 3 days before winter reasserts its dominance. During that time, you collect 12 beaver pelts, a windfall that significantly boosts your season's total. When the temperature plummets again and snow returns, you're well prepared. Extra firewood stacked, traps cleaned and reset, cabin repairs completed. This constant readiness, this awareness of nature's rhythms is as much a part of mountain man life as the physical skills of trapping and building. February gives way to March. Days grow noticeably longer. The sun carries real warmth when it shines. Your thoughts turn increasingly to spring and the changes it will bring. Your cabin, which has sheltered you through the most brutal months, will soon serve different purposes. As temperatures moderate, you'll spend less time inside. The small space that felt cozy in January will feel cramped by May. You'll sleep outside more often, using the cabin primarily for storage and protection from spring storms. By June, you'll leave this valley entirely, heading for rendezvous with your accumulated pelts. The cabin will sit empty through summer and fall. Some mountain men return to the same spot year after year, maintaining and improving their structures over time. Others build new shelters each season, following the beaver to fresh territory. Either way, the principles remain the same. Work with nature, not against it. Build quickly and efficiently with materials at hand. Create systems that breathe and adapt rather than rigid structures that fight natural forces. As March progresses, you begin preparations for the eventual journey to rendezvous. Pelts must be properly dried and bundled. Equipment must be repaired or replaced. Routes must be planned to avoid both natural hazards and potentially hostile native tribes. Through it all, your little trapper's tilt serves faithfully as outside temperatures swing wildly below zero at night, above freezing during the day. The interior remains relatively stable. The thermal mass of the dirt floor and thick logs moderates extremes. The breathable construction prevents condensation from becoming a problem. The living roof adjusts to changing conditions. One particularly warm afternoon, you sit outside on a log, enjoying rare sunshine and taking stock of your winter. Survival itself is an accomplishment in this environment. The pelts you've collected represent not just profit, but proof of skill and endurance. You look at your crude cabin with a sense of pride. No architect designed it, no contractor built it. It came from your own hands, guided by knowledge passed down through generations of mountain men before you, who learned from native peoples before them. That place won't last 5 years, a company man told you when he passed through last fall, eyeing your trapper's tilt with contempt. You just smiled. You've seen abandoned cabins built this way that were still standing after 30 years, while the fancy trading post had to be rebuilt twice in the same period due to rot and structural failure. The knowledge embedded in these simple structures represents something profound. Generations of trial and error in one of Earth's harshest environments, distilled into practical techniques that work with natural forces rather than against them. As April arrives, bringing real spring to the lower elevations, you begin the process of closing down your winter camp. Traps are collected and cleaned for storage. Remaining food supplies are consumed or packed for the journey. The cabin itself requires little preparation. It's designed to weather vacancy as easily as occupation. You'll leave the door slightly ajar when you go. This seems counterintuitive, but it allows air circulation that prevents mustiness and rot. The rain that might enter does no harm to the dirt floor. By next fall, any small creatures that take temporary shelter will be long gone. On your last night in the cabin, you find yourself surprisingly sentimental. This small space has kept you alive through months of potentially lethal cold. Its crude walls have sheltered you from storms that could kill in hours. Its fire pit has provided warmth and cooked your food. Its dirt floor has been your home. Modern people rarely develop such connection to their shelters. They live in spaces designed and built by others using systems they don't understand, surrounded by materials whose properties and origins are mysteries. The mountain man built his own shelter from materials he gathered himself, understanding every aspect of its function through direct experience. There's something profound in that connection, a relationship with shelter that modern construction has largely lost. The trapper's tilt wasn't just a building, it was an extension of the man who built it, a physical manifestation of his understanding of the environment. As you drift towards sleep on your final night, you run your hand along the rough log wall beside your bed. The wood is warm to the touch, alive in its way, still breathing and adapting months after being cut from the forest. Tomorrow you'll pack your furs and supplies on your horses and head toward Rendezvous, leaving this little structure to face the changing seasons alone. But unlike modern buildings that deteriorate during vacancy, your trapper's tilt will likely be in better condition when you return. The logs further seasoned, the chinking more settled, the whole system more harmonized with its environment. That's the final secret of the mountain man's approach to building. Structures that improve with time rather than degrading, that work with natural processes rather than fighting them. Morning brings clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect weather for beginning the long journey to Rendezvous. You pack efficiently. The habits of mountain life don't allow for excess or waste. With your furs carefully bundled and your few possessions packed, you take a final look around the cabin that has been your home through the brutal Rocky Mountain winter. In its crude simplicity, it represents a sophistication that modern construction has largely forgotten. The wisdom of building in harmony with nature rather than in opposition to it. You close the door behind you, leaving it unlatched so the wind can open it slightly. The trapper's tilt will breathe, adapt, and endure, just as it was designed to do nearly 2 centuries ago, when the mountain men discovered building secrets that our best modern architects have somehow forgotten. The journey to Rendezvous begins at dawn. You secure the last bundle of furs to your pack horse, take a final glance at the trapper's tilt that kept you alive through winter, and set your face toward the gathering place. Ahead lies 200 miles of mountain travel, crossing swollen spring streams, navigating passes still choked with snow, and keeping a sharp eye out for Blackfoot war parties who'd love nothing better than to separate you from your hard-earned pelts. This annual migration from isolated winter camps to the boisterous summer rendezvous was the rhythm that defined mountain man life. For months you lived in near-total solitude, with only your thoughts and the howling wind for company. Then suddenly you'd be thrust into a wild gathering of hundreds of trappers, traders, Indians, and the occasional odd tourist from back east. The contrast would give most modern folks psychological whiplash. Your first day on the trail is easy going. The valley floor has mostly thawed, revealing patches of new grass that your horses devour eagerly after a winter of dried forage. You make 15 miles before setting up a simple camp, just a small fire and your buffalo robe under the stars. After months in the confined space of your cabin, even this basic shelter feels luxuriously spacious. As you chew on jerky and watch the fire, your thoughts turn to the economics that drive this whole enterprise, the complex system that connects your solitary winter work to the fashionable streets of London and Paris. It's easy to romanticize the mountain man's life as some pure escape from civilization and commerce. The reality was far more complex. You were essentially a remote worker in a global supply chain, one that stretched from these Rocky Mountain streams all the way to European fashion houses. The money was legitimately good. Each beaver pelt might fetch 5 to $6 at Rendezvous. A skilled trapper could collect 200-300 in a season, earning $1,800, equivalent to about $35,000-$60,000 today. Not bad for 8 months of work, especially when your living expenses were minimal. "You planning to blow it all on whiskey again this year?" Francois asked you last summer, watching you carefully count your season's earnings. "Just half on whiskey," you replied with a grin. "Rest goes to new traps, powder, and maybe a silver hatband if Sublette brought any. The economics of mountain life required this boom and bust approach. You couldn't exactly deposit your earnings in a bank or invest in stocks. You had basically 3 options. Convert your cash to supplies for next season, purchase portable luxuries like silver ornaments or fine weapons, or spend it on immediate pleasures at Rendezvous. Most trappers did all 3 in varying proportions. Your second day on the trail brings the first major obstacle, a river crossing. Winter's snowpack is melting fast in the high country, turning placid streams into raging torrents. This particular crossing was easy last fall. Now it's a frothing, churning monster that makes your horses lay their ears back in fear. You spend an hour scouting upstream, finally finding a wider, shallower section where crossing seems possible. Even so, your heart pounds as you urge your reluctant mount into the icy water. The current immediately tugs at the horse's legs, threatening to sweep you both downstream. "Easy, boy," you mutter, though whether you're reassuring the horse or yourself is unclear. The water rises to your knees, then your thighs, soaking through your buckskins. The bitter cold makes you gasp. Halfway across, your pack horse stumbles, nearly losing his footing and your precious cargo of furs. A season's work hangs in the balance for a few heart-stopping seconds before the horse recovers and continues forward. This is the reality behind the romance of mountain life. Constant, potentially lethal challenges that must be overcome with skill, experience, and sometimes pure luck. The same unforgiving reality shaped the trapper's approach to shelter. There was no room for error, no margin for structures that couldn't withstand whatever the mountains threw at them. You make another 12 miles before evening, setting up camp in a small protected hollow. As you build a fire to dry your still damp clothing, you reflect on the purpose behind all this risk and hardship. The humble beaver. European beaver populations had been hunted to near extinction by the late 1700s, creating insatiable demand for North American pelts. The beaver's dense, water-resistant fur was perfect for making high-fashion hats, those tall, elegant toppers that adorned wealthy men from London to Moscow. What's wild is that you, living in arguably the most primitive conditions imaginable, were directly connected to the height of European fashion. Your skill at finding beaver ponds in remote valleys, setting traps in precisely the right locations, and properly preparing the pelts directly affected whether some banker in London or aristocrat in Paris could purchase the latest style of hat. "Ever seen one of them beaver hats you make possible?" a company man asked a group of trappers at last year's rendezvous. "Saw a picture once," old Williams replied. "Looked damn silly if you ask me." Most mountain men found it amusing that they endured freezing streams, grizzly attacks, and Blackfoot raids so that dandies an ocean away could wear fancy hats. But the money was real, and for many, the freedom of mountain life was worth any hardship. Day 3 brings your first glimpse of other travellers. Smoke from a camp about 2 miles off your route. You approach cautiously, rifle ready. In mountain country, strangers could be friends, enemies, or something in between. It turns out to be 3 trappers you know vaguely from previous rendezvous: Johnson, a towering Virginian with a missing ear; Baptiste, a French Shoshone half-breed known for his tracking skills; and Cooper, a former school teacher from Pennsylvania who took to mountain life with surprising ease. "Well, if it ain't the cabin builder," Johnson calls as you approach. "Your reputation for constructing particularly effective winter shelters has apparently spread." "Heard you wintered in that new valley past the 3 peaks," Baptiste says as you dismount. "Good beaver?" "Good enough," you reply non-committally, never wise to be too specific about your trapping grounds. "How'd that tilt I showed you how to build hold up?" "Saved my damn life during that January cold snap," Johnson admits. "Never would have thought putting the notches on top made sense, but that cabin was tight as a drum all winter." This exchange illustrates another aspect of mountain life, the paradoxical mix of secrecy and knowledge sharing. Trappers guarded their best beaver locations jealously, but freely shared survival techniques like cabin building methods. A man might withhold information that could make you rich, but would readily teach skills that could keep you alive. You share their fire and food for the night, exchanging news and rumours. 3 crow hunters killed by Blackfoot near the Big Bend. Company bringing new trade goods this year, including actual glass windows for those building permanent cabins. A new settlement growing near the eastern passes, bringing more tourists and curiosity seekers to rendezvous. The conversation eventually turns to shelters, with each man describing his winter accommodations and any innovations they've developed. "Added a sort of shelf above the fire," Cooper explains, sketching in the dirt with a stick. "Hot air rises and gets trapped there. Kept extra furs on it to dry and had a warmer sleeping spot. Been experimenting with that mixture the flatheads use for chinking," Baptiste adds. "Clay, grass, and some kind of root they pound to powder. Sets hard but still breathes. Best I've ever used." This constant refinement, this sharing of techniques and innovations, was how the trapper's shelter evolved. Despite having no formal documentation or training, it was practical knowledge passed man to man, tested against the harshest conditions imaginable. You part ways the next morning, each group following their own route toward rendezvous. The remainder of your journey passes without major incident. A minor horse lameness that resolves after a day's rest, a tense but ultimately peaceful encounter with a small band of Shoshone hunters. A difficult mountain pass, still deep with rotting snow. 15 days after leaving your winter cabin, you crest a final ridge and see it, the sprawling, chaotic encampment of the annual rendezvous. Hundreds of lodges and tents spread across a lush valley. Smoke from dozens of fires rises into the clear summer sky. The distant sounds of shouting, laughter, and occasional gunfire drift up to your position. After months of solitude, the sensory impact is overwhelming. You take a moment to prepare yourself before urging your horses down toward the gathering. The rendezvous system was a stroke of commercial genius. Before its establishment in 1825, trappers had to travel all the way to St. Louis to sell their furs and buy supplies. William Ashley of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company realized it would be more efficient to bring the trading post to the trappers, setting up a temporary market in the mountain country each summer. As you ride into camp, the contrasts of rendezvous life are immediately apparent. Company men in relatively clean Eastern clothing staff elaborate trading areas with carefully arranged goods. Nearby, mountain men in ragged buckskins and greasy beards compare pelts and boast of their winter exploits. Native people from multiple tribes set up their own camps on the periphery, bringing meat, horses, and handicrafts to trade. You make your way to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company's main trading area, where your season's harvest will be evaluated and purchased. The bundle of beaver pelts representing months of freezing work is untied, each skin examined carefully by the company buyer. 162 prime pelts, he pronounces finally. Some water damage on these 5, and these 3 weren't properly fleshed. Call it 154 prime at $6 each, and the damaged ones at 4. That's $950 total. You expected this. Company buyers always found flaws, real or imagined, to reduce their payments. Still, it's a good sum, enough to re-outfit completely and have plenty left for luxuries and celebration. Now comes the second phase of the transaction, purchasing supplies for next season, new traps to replace broken ones, powder and lead for your rifle, coffee, sugar and tobacco, a new skinning knife, fish hooks, awls for leatherwork, all the essentials that can't be crafted from natural materials. These goods carried steep markups. A knife that cost 50 cents in St. Louis might sell for $3 at Rendezvous. Powder and lead often saw 300–400% price increases. The company men weren't running a charity. They were there to profit from both ends of the transaction. Highway robbery, grumbles a trapper next to you, examining a basic wool blanket with a $10 price tag. Try making your own blanket 200 miles from nowhere, replies the clerk with a shrug. You're not paying for the item, you're paying for it being here. He had a point. The logistics of transporting tons of trade goods over hundreds of miles of rough country, with no roads and hostile tribes along the way, were legitimately challenging. Those difficulties were reflected in the prices. With your essential supplies secured, you turn to more pleasant expenditures. A silver-mounted pipe catches your eye, beautiful and practical since your old one cracked during winter. A red wool shirt seems positively luxurious after months in stiff buckskin. And yes, several bottles of whiskey, the universal currency of celebration at Rendezvous. The economic transaction complete, you're free to enjoy the social aspects of the gathering. For the next 2 weeks, this valley will host a non-stop party interspersed with contests of skill, trading of information, forming and breaking of partnerships, and occasional violence. You find old friends, share stories of winter hardships and spring journeys. You participate in shooting contests, winning a fine powder horn in one competition. You lose $3 in a marathon poker game, but consider it cheap entertainment. You watch wrestling matches between mountain men and Shoshone warriors, with serious betting on both sides. The contrast with your winter solitude couldn't be more profound. From months of hearing nothing but wind and your own thoughts to a constant cacophony of humanity, from strict conservation of resources to temporary abundance and even waste, from survival-focused discipline to wild indulgence. "How do you stand it?" asks a newcomer from Boston, covering his ears as a drunken trapper fires his rifle into the air nearby. "The noise? The chaos?" You smile, remembering your own first rendezvous years ago. "Winter's coming soon enough," you tell him. "Plenty of quiet then." Amidst the revelry, serious business continues. Information about beaver populations, hostile tribal movements, and new territories is exchanged, sometimes freely, sometimes purchased with trade goods or whiskey. Maps are drawn in the dirt, refined on paper by company men, then carefully memorized by trappers who may be illiterate but can navigate vast wilderness with uncanny precision. You learn of a promising new valley 2 weeks' journey northwest of your winter camp. Several trappers confirm good beaver sign, but warn of increased Blackfoot activity in the region. You file this away, already planning next season's location. As the rendezvous begins to wind down, you make your final preparations for the coming year. Your supplies are carefully packed and distributed between your horses. Your newly purchased goods are properly stowed. You've sobered up after several days of celebration, ready to return to the disciplined mindset that survival requires. The economics of the fur trade directly shaped how mountain men lived and built. The need to maximize beaver harvests meant constructing shelters quickly so more time could be spent setting and checking traps. The seasonal nature of the work, with prime pelts available only during colder months, required winter habitation in remote locations. The high value of beaver pelts justified the extreme risks and hardships of mountain life. All these factors pushed the evolution of the trapper's tilt, a shelter that could be built rapidly with minimal tools, withstand brutal winter conditions, and be abandoned without regret when better trapping grounds were discovered. On your last night at rendezvous, sitting around a fire with several veteran mountain men, the conversation turns to changes coming to the mountains. Beaver populations are noticeably declining in many areas. European fashion is shifting away from beaver hats toward silk alternatives. New settlers are pushing into previously remote territories. "This life won't last forever," observes Williams, who's been trapping longer than anyone present. "Maybe another 10 years if we're lucky." He was right, though none of you fully realized it then. The golden age of the mountain man would end by the 1840s, victim of changing fashion, over-trapping, and westward expansion. Many would become guides for settler wagons or scouts for the US Army. Others would settle into farming or ranching. Some would simply disappear into ever more remote regions, chasing a vanishing way of life. But the knowledge they developed, particularly their building techniques, would persist in various forms. Settlers moving west would adopt aspects of the trapper's tilt for their own first shelters. Native peoples would incorporate European tools into their traditional building methods, creating hybrid structures. The practical wisdom of building with local materials in harmony with natural forces would continue to influence frontier construction long after the fur trade collapsed. As dawn breaks on departure day, you take one last look at the trampled valley that hosted the rendezvous. The great gathering is dispersing, some men heading back to St. Louis with the fur companies, others striking out for new trapping territories, still others joining native bands where they have wives and children. You mount up and point your horses northwest toward that promising valley you heard about. The cycle begins again. The journey to new territory, the selection of a cabin site, the rapid construction of a trapper's tilt, the months of solitary trapping in harsh conditions. It's a life few modern people could comprehend, let alone endure. But in its harsh simplicity, in its direct connection between effort and survival, there was something pure that our comfortable modern existence rarely provides. As you ride away from rendezvous, your thoughts return to the cabin you left behind months ago. It's standing empty now, perhaps providing temporary shelter to passing wildlife. By the time snow flies again, you'll have built another one using the same forgotten techniques. The top notch, the green logs, the living roof, the breathable chinking. Each new cabin benefits from accumulated experience, small refinements added with each construction. This season, you plan to try that root powder the flatheads use in their chinking mixture. You'll implement Cooper's above-fire shelf design. The structure will be similar to last year's, but slightly improved, part of the constant evolution of practical knowledge that defined mountain life. Modern builders with their engineering degrees and computer models might scoff at this trial-and-error approach, but the proof is in the results. Trapper tilts that remained standing and functional for decades, while more advanced structures rotted within years. The mountain man's building wisdom wasn't static knowledge to be preserved unchanged. It was a living tradition, constantly adapting and evolving based on direct experience with natural forces. That dynamism, that willingness to learn from both success and failure, was perhaps the most valuable aspect of their forgotten knowledge. As you disappear into the forest, headed toward new territory and new challenges, you carry with you not just supplies and weapons, but this accumulated wisdom, the practical knowledge of how to create shelter that works with nature rather than against it, that breathes and adapts rather than fighting, inevitably losing battles against time and elements. It's knowledge that deserves to be remembered, not as a quaint historical curiosity, but as a sophisticated approach to building that modern construction might profitably rediscover. The journey to your new trapping grounds takes nearly 3 weeks. You follow winding game trails through mountain passes, ford numerous streams, and navigate vast stretches of wilderness using only the sun, stars, and landmarks for guidance. No maps, no compass, no GPS, just the accumulated knowledge of terrain stored in your head. Late August finds you in a promising valley, one described by several trusted trappers at Rendezvous. It checks all the boxes: abundant beaver sign along the streams, good timber for building, natural meadows with grass for your horses, and a relatively sheltered position that should moderate the worst winter winds. Time to choose a cabin site. This decision is crucial. Get it wrong, and you might face a winter of misery or even death. Modern builders have the luxury of changing their minds. In the mountains, with winter approaching, you get one chance to choose correctly. You spend 2 days exploring the valley, examining potential locations with the careful eye of experience. Each site gets evaluated on multiple factors. Proximity to water, close enough for convenience but high enough to avoid spring flooding, available building materials, good straight trees nearby for logs, clay soil for chinking, solar exposure, a south-facing location to catch winter sun, but with enough tree cover for wind protection. Natural drainage, slightly elevated ground where snowmelt will flow away from the structure. Security, good sight lines to spot approaching threats, but not so exposed as to be visible from a distance. On the 3rd day, you find it, a small, relatively flat bench about 30 feet above a stream, nestled against a rocky outcrop that will provide both wind protection and reflected heat. The spot gets good sun from mid-morning through afternoon. Several stands of straight lodgepole pines grow within easy dragging distance. The soil is a perfect mix of clay and sand. Well, this is home for the next 6 months, you tell your horses, who seem singularly unimpressed by your real estate assessment. With the site chosen, you immediately begin preparations. First, you establish a temporary camp, just enough shelter to sleep comfortably while you build a more substantial cabin. Then you start gathering materials. The basic design will be similar to last year's cabin, a trapper's tilt of about 10 back 9 feet with a single pitch roof, but you're planning several improvements based on knowledge gained at Rendezvous. You'll try Baptiste's flathead chinking mixture, incorporating a certain root that gets pounded to powder and apparently improves water resistance while maintaining breathability. You'll implement Cooper's above-fire shelf design for additional storage and drying space. And you'll experiment with a slightly steeper roof pitch, which Old Williams swears improves snow shedding without compromising stability. These small innovations illustrate how mountain man building techniques weren't static but constantly evolving through shared experience and experimentation. Each cabin incorporated lessons learned from previous structures, adapted to specific sites and materials, fine-tuned through harsh trial and error. You begin by clearing the cabin site, removing small trees and brush and roughly levelling the ground where needed. Then you fell your first trees, straight lodge poles about 8 inches in diameter. The sound of your axe echoes through the valley, probably the first human noise these mountains have heard in months. What kind of foundation are you laying? A modern builder might ask, watching you place the first sill logs directly on the ground. The answer, of course, is hardly any foundation at all, just the sill logs themselves, perhaps half buried in the earth for stability. In damp environments, this would indeed be a recipe for rot, but in the relatively dry mountain climate, with breathable construction, allowing moisture to escape, these ground contact logs could last for decades. Working alone with just an axe, a saw, and a few basic tools, you make remarkable progress. By the end of the first day, your sill logs are in place. By the end of the second, you have the first 3 rounds of wall logs notched and positioned. The top notching technique shows its value. You can complete a notch in about 3 minutes and set a log in roughly 12. No way that's gonna last, a visitor from St. Louis had said at Rendezvous, watching a demonstration of top notching. Water'll pool in those notches and rot the whole works in a season. You smiled but didn't argue. Let him believe what he wanted. You'd seen 30-year-old trapper tilts still standing solid with the same flawed technique. The proof was in the results, not the theory. By the 5th day, your walls are up to shoulder height. The structure is taking shape, already providing some wind protection even without a roof. You take a moment to stand inside the partial cabin, mentally arranging the space. Sleeping area here, fire pit there, storage along that wall. It's tiny by modern standards, about 90 square feet total. A typical modern bathroom is larger, but for a single mountain man through winter, it's entirely adequate. The small space heats quickly with minimal fuel and allows for efficient use of limited resources. Working sunrise to sunset, you finish the walls by the end of the first week. The logs are notched and fitted, with gaps that will later receive chinking. The crude door frame is in place, just a reinforced opening with wooden pegs for hinges. No windows yet. You'll add an oiled paper window once the basic structure is complete. Now for the roof, arguably the most sophisticated element of the trapper's tilt. You begin by cutting long, straight poles to span from wall to wall. These aren't massive beams, but relatively slender poles, 3 to 4 inches in diameter. Individually, they wouldn't support much weight. Together, they create a surprisingly strong framework. The genius is in the simplicity, a cabin restorer once explained when examining an original trapper's tilt. These guys weren't engineers, but they understood load distribution intuitively. With the pole framework complete, you move to the next layer, the bark covering. Here, timing becomes crucial. Late August isn't ideal for bark harvesting. Spring is better when the sap is running, but there are still trees where the bark can be removed in usable sheets. You select several large pines and carefully peel sections of bark, some as large as 3 feet by 5 feet. It's painstaking work, requiring patience and skill to remove the bark without breaking it. By day's end, you've collected enough to cover about half the roof. Tomorrow, you'll gather the rest. The bark gets laid over the poles in overlapping layers, starting at the bottom edge and working upward, just like shingles on a modern roof. The slight pitch created by placing the fat ends of the wall logs toward the front ensures that water will flow downward rather than pooling. With the bark layer complete, you move to the final and most distinctive element, the living layer of sod and soil. Using a crude shovel made from a flattened tin can attached to a wooden handle, you cut sections of meadow sod, roots and all, and transport them to the cabin. "Wait, you're putting dirt on your roof?" a newcomer would ask, baffled by what seems like a primitive solution. But this living layer is far from primitive. It's a sophisticated environmental management system that provides insulation, water absorption and release, wind resistance, and even self-repair as plants continue to grow and roots intertwine. You lay the sod grass side down on top of the bark layer, creating a thick living blanket across the entire roof. On top of this goes a final thin layer of soil and moss gathered from the forest floor. Within weeks, this top layer will integrate with the sod beneath, creating a cohesive, water-managing system. The roof complete, you turn to chinking, filling the gaps between logs. Here, you'll implement Baptiste's flathead mixture. You've collected the specific root he described, pounded it to powder, and mixed it with clay, sand, and dried grass. The resulting mixture is similar to traditional chinking, but has a slightly different texture, more fibrous and somehow more cohesive. You pack it into the gaps between logs, careful to fill completely without overcompressing. The goal is not an airtight seal, but a breathable membrane that allows moisture to escape while keeping the worst of the weather out. With walls chinked and roof complete, your trapper's tilt is essentially finished, a task accomplished in just under 2 weeks of solo work. A modern construction crew with power tools and materials would struggle to match this timeline, particularly in such a remote location. The final touches come next. A crude door made from split logs bound together with rawhide, a smoke hole with an adjustable cover, an oiled paper window for light. Inside, you build Cooper's above fire shelf, a simple but effective innovation for storage and drying. You construct a sleeping platform on one side, just a raised area of smooth logs covered with pine boughs. You build small storage shelves in the corners using sticks wedged between logs. You dig a small root cellar beneath the floor in one corner, lined with rocks and covered with a wooden hatch, perfect for storing items that shouldn't freeze. By early September, your cabin is complete and fully functional. From first tree felling to moving in took less than 3 weeks, an impressive feat of efficient design and construction. The structure contains no nails, no manufactured materials except for the oiled paper window, no components that couldn't be created on site with basic tools. Yet this primitive shelter will keep you alive through months of potentially lethal cold. It will withstand heavy snow loads, bitter winds, temperature fluctuations of 70 degrees or more. It will remain standing for decades with minimal maintenance, while far more advanced structures fail in just a few years. With your shelter secured, you turn to the real purpose of being here, trapping beaver. You spend several days exploring the nearby streams, identifying prime beaver habitat, and planning your trap line. You build secondary shelters, crude lean-tos at the furthest points of your territory, emergency refuges in case of sudden storms. As September progresses, you set your first experimental traps, testing locations and techniques. The serious trapping won't begin until the beaver fur primes up with the colder weather of late October, but these early efforts help you map the territory and understand the local beaver population. One crisp morning, returning to your cabin after checking traps, you find unexpected visitors, 3 flathead hunters who spotted your smoke and came to investigate. Such encounters could be dangerous with certain tribes, but the flatheads are generally friendly to trappers. "Good cabin," the oldest hunter comments in broken English, examining your nearly completed structure. "Flathead way." He's not wrong. Many trapper techniques were adapted from native building methods, modified to suit European tools and needs. The living roof in particular shows clear indigenous influence. Many tribes used similar systems for their winter lodges. Through a mixture of broken English, sign language, and shared words from the developing mountain pigeon, you establish friendly relations. They share fresh elk meat from a recent kill. You offer coffee and tobacco. Information is exchanged about beaver populations, Blackfoot movements, the location of other trappers. Before departing, the oldest hunter offers a suggestion for your chinking mixture, a certain type of moss that, when mixed with clay, creates an especially effective sealant while still allowing the logs to breathe. You thank him and make a mental note to collect some when possible. This knowledge exchange was typical of mountain life. European, American, and native techniques blended and evolved, creating hybrid approaches that were often superior to any of the originals. The trapper's tilt itself was such a hybrid, incorporating Native American concepts like the living roof and breathable walls with European notching techniques and tools. October brings the first serious cold and occasional snow flurries. Your cabin passes its initial tests with flying colours. The fire quickly warms the small space, with heat radiating from the dirt floor long after the flames die down. The living roof sheds light snow while providing excellent insulation. The chinking hardens but remains slightly flexible, adapting to the minor shifts and creaks of the settling structure. "She's talking to you," old Williams had said at your first cabin raising years ago when you commented on the creaking sounds. A good cabin talks. It's when they fall silent that you need to worry. He meant that the small adjustments, the creaks, shifts, and settling sounds were signs of a living structure adapting to changing conditions. A cabin that stopped talking had become rigid, fighting against natural forces rather than accommodating them. Such rigidity inevitably led to catastrophic failure. As October turns to November and serious trapping begins, you settle into the rhythm of mountain winter, up before dawn, checking traps in bitter cold, returning to the warmth of your tilt to process the day's catch. The cabin becomes an extension of yourself, a second skin against the hostile environment. You notice that Baptiste's chinking mixture does indeed perform better than your previous formula. It sets harder, but somehow remains more breathable, preventing condensation from forming inside even during extreme temperature swings. The above fire shelf proves invaluable for drying gloves, moccasins, and small pelts. Winter deepens, bringing the brutal cold of January. Outside temperatures drop to 30 below zero or lower. Inside your trapper's tilt, while far from cozy by modern standards, conditions remain survivable. The fire's heat, the insulating properties of the logs and living roof, the dirt floor's thermal mass, together, they create a microclimate that stays above freezing even during the coldest nights. One particularly vicious storm brings 4 feet of snow in 2 days, with winds that drive it into drifts twice that height. You remain cabin-bound for nearly a week, forced to dig your way out through a snow tunnel when the weather finally breaks. Such storms would destroy many modern structures, the weight of snow collapsing roofs, wind finding weaknesses in rigid materials, extreme cold causing pipes to burst and materials to crack. Your primitive shelter takes it in stride. The living roof supports the snow load easily. The flexible construction bends with the wind rather than fighting it. The absence of plumbing means no freezing pipes. The integrated nature of the trapper's tilt, its working with natural forces rather than against them, proves its worth during these extreme events. It's not that the cabin is impervious to the elements, it's that it's designed to adapt to them, to yield where necessary and stand firm where possible. As February gives way to March and the first hints of spring appear, you take stock of your season. You've collected nearly 200 beaver pelts, a good harvest that will fetch around $200 at Rendezvous. You've survived another Rocky Mountain winter in one of Earth's harshest environments, and your cabin, your simple, primitive shelter, has once again proven the validity of forgotten building wisdom. The trapper's tilt, with its seemingly crude techniques and natural materials, embodies a sophisticated understanding of environmental forces and material properties. It represents not primitive construction, but highly evolved design, refined through generations of harsh testing where failure meant death. As modern buildings continue to fail despite increasingly complex engineering and expensive materials, perhaps it's time to reconsider what we've lost in our rush to improve upon the past. The top notch, the green logs, the living roof, the breathable chinking, these weren't compromises forced by limited technology, but sophisticated solutions evolved through practical experience. The mountain man's cabin wasn't just shelter, it was a philosophy of building embodied in logs and clay, a philosophy that acknowledged nature's power and worked with it rather than against it. And as your trapper's tilt stands firm against another Rocky Mountain storm, while million-dollar log mansions rot away in Aspen and Vale, perhaps it's a philosophy worth rediscovering. Spring arrives to the mountains in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a snowstorm, bright sunshine giving way to freezing rain. The cycle of freezing and thawing is actually more dangerous than the consistent cold of deep winter. It creates unpredictable conditions, rotten ice on streams, sudden avalanches, mud that can trap a horse up to its belly. But spring also brings the end of trapping season. As beaver begin to shed their winter coats, the quality of pelts declines. By mid-April, it's hardly worth setting traps at all. Time to begin preparations for the journey to Rendezvous. Before leaving your cabin, you take time for reflection. The structure has served you well through another brutal winter, despite temperatures that sometimes plunge to 40 below, despite snow loads that would collapse many modern roofs, despite winds that could tear poorly built structures apart. Your simple trapper's tilt has remained solid, dry, and livable. The improvements you incorporated this season proved their worth. Baptiste's Chinking mixture maintained its integrity better than any previous formula you've used. Cooper's above fire shelf became an essential feature for drying gear and storing items that needed to stay warm. The slightly steeper roof pitch did indeed shed snow more effectively. This constant refinement, this evolution of techniques through practical experience, is how mountain men developed and preserved their building knowledge. No books, no formal training, no engineering studies, just harsh trial and error where mistakes could be fatal, with successful innovations shared and adopted across a loose network of individualists. How'd that mixture work out, Baptiste will ask when you see him at Rendezvous, and your detailed report will become part of the collective wisdom, perhaps inspiring further refinements by others. This informal knowledge transfer system was remarkably effective, despite its lack of structure. Techniques spread quickly when they worked, were modified to suit different environments and materials, and gradually evolved into proven approaches that withstood the harshest testing imaginable. As you pack your accumulated furs and prepare for departure, you take one final walk through your cabin. Unlike modern buildings that deteriorate when abandoned, your trapper's tilt will likely be in better condition when you return. The logs further seasoned, the chinking more settled, the whole system more harmonized with its environment. You leave the door slightly ajar, as is traditional. A completely sealed cabin would develop mustiness and potential rot. The slight airflow keeps the interior dry, while the dirt floor easily handles any rain that might enter. By next fall, the structure will have breathed through the seasons, ready to shelter you or another trapper once again. This approach, designing for vacancy as well as occupation, reflects the mountain man's deep understanding of natural processes. Modern buildings typically deteriorate when unoccupied, requiring constant human intervention to prevent decay. The trapper's tilt, working with natural forces rather than against them, often improved during periods of disuse. Your journey to Rendezvous takes a different route this year, longer but less challenging than the direct path over high mountain passes still choked with snow. Along the way, you encounter other trappers also headed to the gathering, and small travelling groups begin to form. 3 days into your journey, you join forces with an odd pair, McAllister, a veteran Scottish trapper with 20 years in the mountains, and young George, a newcomer experiencing his first season. The contrast between them illustrates how mountain knowledge was passed down. Boy nearly froze to death in February, McAllister explains during an evening camp. Found him huddled under a rock overhang, fire gone out, too cold to even strike flint. Another hour and he'd have been done for. Young George nods sheepishly. Never felt cold like that before. Couldn't think straight. Fingers wouldn't work. Took him back to my cabin, McAllister continues. Nursed him through the worst of it, then figured I might as well teach him proper while I had him. Boy's a quick study once he stops being stupid. This informal apprenticeship, often born of necessity rather than design, was how mountain skills transferred between generations. No formal schools existed for trapping or wilderness survival. Knowledge passed from experienced hands to novice ones through direct demonstration and supervised practice. "Show me how you notched them logs again," young George asks you the next morning, watching as you repair a small lean-to at your campsite. You demonstrate the top-notch technique, explaining as you work. Cut about halfway through, straight down. Then when you place it, the weight of the log seats it firmly. Green wood's easier to cut, but still strong. As it dries, it shrinks and tightens. "But don't water collect in them notches?" he asks, repeating the concern of many newcomers. "That's where the breathing comes in," you explain patiently. "Whole cabin has to breathe. Roof, walls, chinking. Water gets in, but it also gets out. It's when water gets trapped that rot starts." Young George practices on a fallen branch, his technique clumsy but improving with each attempt. By the time you break camp, he's grasped the basic principle, if not the smooth execution that comes with experience. This scene, repeated countless times across the mountains, was how wilderness building knowledge survived and spread despite almost no written documentation, direct demonstration, hands-on practice, and the harsh reality that poor technique could mean death in winter ensured that effective methods endured while flawed approaches were quickly abandoned. As your journey continues, your group gradually grows. 2 French-Canadian trappers join, then a mixed-blood Delaware with his Crow wife, then a former sailor from Boston who found more freedom in the mountains than at sea. By the time you approach Rendezvous, you're travelling with 11 people, a small temporary community bound by shared experience, if not always shared backgrounds. Around evening fires, knowledge continues to flow. The Delaware shows a new method for smoking beaver meat to improve its keeping qualities. One of the Canadians demonstrates a snowshoe binding that prevents foot blisters on long treks. The sailor, surprisingly, has developed an improved roof sealing technique adapted from ship caulking. You contribute your experiences with the flathead chinking mixture, explaining in detail how it's prepared and applied. Several men take serious interest, asking questions and making mental notes for their own future cabins. This free exchange of survival information contrasts sharply with the secretive approach to trapping locations. No one shares their best beaver streams, but everyone shares building and survival techniques. The unspoken understanding is clear. Competition for wealth is expected, but no one benefits from preventable deaths in the wilderness. The mountain man community operated on this paradoxical blend of fierce independence and mutual support. Men who might fight over trapping territory or trading advantages would risk their lives to rescue a stranger in trouble. Information that improved survival chances spread rapidly, while knowledge that might lead to profit was closely guarded. As you near rendezvous, signs of other travellers increase. Scattered camps appear along the trail. Occasional gunshots echo through valleys as hunters provide meat for the gathering or trappers announce their approach to friends. The isolation of winter gives way to the sociability of summer. The Delaware's wife, a quiet woman who shared little during the journey, unexpectedly approaches you one evening. In halting English mixed with sign language, she explains that her people have a different method for preparing the root used in chinking, boiling it with certain minerals before drying and pounding it to powder. "Make stronger," she explains, mimicking hardness with her hands. "Last many winters." You thank her sincerely for this knowledge. The exchange highlights another aspect of mountain wisdom, the cross-cultural transmission of techniques between native and European traditions. The most successful trappers were those who recognized and adopted effective indigenous approaches rather than clinging to familiar European methods unsuited to the environment. This cultural exchange went both ways. Native groups adopted metal tools, firearms, and certain European building techniques when they proved superior for specific purposes. The resulting hybrid approaches often surpassed either tradition alone in practical effectiveness. The day before reaching rendezvous, your group encounters a sobering reminder of the mountain's dangers. At a river crossing, you discover a crude wooden cross marking a fresh grave. The name E. Monroe is carved clumsily into the wood, with the date of death just 3 weeks earlier. No one in your group knew Monroe personally, but several had heard of him, a third-year trapper who developed a reputation for carelessness. Speculation about his death centers on the obvious hazard nearby, a deceptively powerful river that appears calm on the surface, but hides treacherous currents. "Seen too many go that way," McAllister murmurs, removing his hat briefly before the grave. "River looks gentle till it's wrapped around your legs, then it's too late." The moment underscores the unforgiving reality that shaped mountain knowledge. Techniques and approaches that survived did so because they worked repeatedly in lethal conditions. Methods that failed, along with the men who relied on them, disappeared from the knowledge pool. It was natural selection applied to wilderness skills, harsh but effective at refining practical wisdom. Late the following day, your group arrives at rendezvous. The gathering is smaller than last year, perhaps 300 people compared to nearly 500 previously. The decline reflects changing conditions in the fur trade. Beaver populations are noticeably reduced in many areas. Prices have dropped slightly as European fashion begins shifting towards silk hats rather than beaver felt. "Half as many here as 5 years ago," observes a veteran trapper named Roberts as you share his fire that evening. "Country's getting trapped out. Fashion's changing too. Won't be a trapper's world much longer." He's not wrong, though none of you fully realise it yet. The golden age of the mountain man is already ending. Within a decade, the fur trade will collapse almost completely, victim of changing fashion, over-trapping, and westward expansion. The knowledge and skills you've all developed will either find new applications or fade into obscurity. Some aspects of mountain wisdom will persist, adopted by settlers, military scouts, and later outdoorsmen who recognise their practical value. Other elements will be forgotten, dismissed as primitive by a society increasingly enamoured with technological solutions. The trapper's approach to shelter, working with natural forces rather than against them, building with local materials in ways that breathe and adapt, will largely disappear from mainstream construction. Modern builders will embrace increasingly complex systems that attempt to create perfect barriers against the elements, a fundamentally different philosophy that often produces less durable results. This loss happens gradually, without anyone quite noticing what's vanishing. By the time people recognise the value of certain traditional approaches, the detailed practical knowledge that made them work has often disappeared. Written descriptions survive, but the hands-on techniques, the small adjustments and adaptations that made the difference between success and failure are lost. Yet fragments of mountain wisdom endure in unexpected places. Old hunting cabins in remote locations still incorporate top-notching and breathable design. Certain rural building traditions maintain elements of the living roof system. Indigenous communities preserve aspects of the chinking techniques developed through cross-cultural exchange. And occasionally, someone rediscovers these approaches through practical necessity or historical curiosity. They build a shelter using the old methods and find, to their surprise, that it outperforms modern alternatives in certain conditions. The knowledge, though diminished, never completely disappears. At Rendezvous, the present concerns outweigh such future considerations. You sell your accumulated pelts, 207 prime beaver at $5.75 each, plus a dozen otter at $7, for a total of nearly $1,200. A solid season's work that will provide supplies for next year with plenty left for luxuries and celebration. The social aspects of Rendezvous are as important as the economic ones. You reconnect with old friends, share stories of winter hardships, compare innovations and discoveries. You participate in shooting contests, foot races and wrestling matches. You enjoy temporary abundance after months of careful conservation. During a quieter moment, you find yourself in conversation with old Williams, who must be approaching 60, an almost unheard of age for an active mountain man. His face is weathered to leather with scars from Blackfoot arrows, grizzly claws, and countless winter storms. But his eyes remain sharp, taking in everything around him. Built me a permanent place last fall, he tells you, describing a more substantial cabin near the trading post at Fort Bridger. Figured these old bones deserve solid walls for what winters I got left. He describes the structure, larger than a typical trapper's tilt, with a proper stone fireplace and glass windows, traded at considerable expense. But the core techniques remain the same. Top-notched logs with the bark left on, a living roof system, though more carefully engineered for the larger span. Breathable chinking with his own secret mixture that includes, he hints with a wink, something from them hot springs that bubbles like it's alive. Williams represents the culmination of mountain building wisdom, decades of practical experience distilled into techniques that work consistently in the harshest conditions. His knowledge, gained through thousands of nights in hundreds of shelters across the Rockies, is invaluable but largely undocumented. Should write it all down someday, he muses. How to build proper so things last. But who'd read it? Young fellows think they know better till winter nearly kills them, just like we did. This was the tragedy and triumph of mountain knowledge. Each generation learned largely through its own mistakes, guided but not protected by the wisdom of veterans who'd survived similar errors. The system produced extraordinarily capable individuals, but relied on direct transmission that proved vulnerable to disruption. As Rendezvous continues, you notice another sign of changing times. Several tourists from back east, wealthy adventurers who've paid guides extravagant sums to witness the Mountain Man gathering. They watch the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and horror, clearly shocked by the rough conditions and rougher men. "They think we're wild animals," laughs Cooper, noticing your observation. 20 years from now, they'll be selling tickets to see authentic mountain men in travelling shows. His prediction proves more accurate than he knows. As the fur trade collapses, some mountain men will indeed end up as performers, displaying exaggerated versions of their skills for paying audiences. Others will become scouts for the army or guides for wagon trains of settlers. Many will simply disappear into increasingly remote regions, chasing a vanishing way of life. The knowledge they developed, particularly their building techniques, will fracture and scatter. Some elements will be preserved in frontier construction, others in rural traditions. Much will be forgotten, dismissed as primitive by a society embracing industrial materials and methods. But the proof of their wisdom remains in the structures themselves. Even today, abandoned trapper tilts can sometimes be found in remote mountain valleys, simple shelters built nearly 2 centuries ago that still stand while more advanced structures have long since collapsed. These humble cabins with their top-notched logs and living roofs, their breathable walls and dirt floors, represent a sophisticated understanding of natural forces and material properties. They weren't primitive compromises forced by limited technology, but elegant solutions evolved through harsh practical testing. As Rendezvous winds down and trappers prepare for another season, the knowledge continues to flow. Veterans like Williams share advice with newcomers like young George. Successful innovations spread rapidly through the community. Failed approaches are analysed and avoided. This living tradition, this practical wisdom refined through generations of trial and error, was the mountain man's true legacy. Not just the trails they blazed or the territories they explored, but the deep understanding of how to live in harmony with one of Earth's harshest environments. And perhaps that's the most valuable lesson from the forgotten knowledge of the mountain man, that sometimes the most sophisticated approach isn't fighting against natural forces, but working with them, not sealing away from nature, but creating systems that breathe, adapt, and endure. By the early 1840s, the golden age of the mountain man was drawing to a close. Beaver populations had been drastically reduced in most accessible areas. Fashion in Europe was shifting decisively towards silk hats rather than beaver felt. The Western territories were filling with settlers, farmers, and townspeople, civilization encroaching on what had been wilderness just years before. The mountain men themselves faced a crossroads. Some adapted, becoming guides for wagon trains or scouts for the US Army. Others settled down, establishing trading posts or ranches in the territories they once trapped. Many simply disappeared, pushing into increasingly remote regions, seeking the vanishing freedom they'd come to treasure. Their building knowledge, the sophisticated understanding of how to create shelters that worked with natural forces rather than against them, fragmented along with their community. Some elements were adopted by settlers who recognized their practical value for frontier construction. Other techniques were preserved by native peoples who continued traditional building approaches alongside adopted European methods. but much was simply lost, dismissed as primitive by a society embracing industrial materials and engineered solutions. The notching techniques, the living roof systems, the breathable chinking mixtures, these fell out of mainstream construction as standardized methods, and manufactured materials became widely available. This loss occurred gradually, without most people noticing what was disappearing by the time historical interest in mountain men developed in the late 19th century. Many of their practical skills had already vanished. Written descriptions survived, but the hands-on techniques, the small adjustments and adaptations that made the difference between success and failure were largely gone. Imagine standing in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in the summer of 1880, just 40 years after the peak of the fur trade. The valley that once hosted raucous rendezvous is now dotted with proper farms and small settlements. The few remaining mountain men are elderly curiosities, telling tales that grow taller with each passing year. One such figure might be Old Williams, now truly ancient by frontier standards, perhaps approaching 80. He sits on the porch of a trading post that's evolving into a proper store, watching with rheumy eyes as the world he knew vanishes. Built a cabin up Grovant way back in 28, he tells anyone who'll listen. Top-notch the logs, put on a proper living roof. Ain't been back in 30 years, but I'd bet good money she's still standing. Young men humour him but don't really listen. They're building with milled lumber now, with factory-made nails, with standardised windows and doors. The idea of chopping a notch in the top of a log seems primitive, inefficient, simply wrong. Yet in remote valleys across the Rockies, evidence of the mountain man's wisdom remains. Abandoned trapper tilts, simple structures built in the 1820s and 1830s, still stand after decades of exposure to brutal weather. Their logs have weathered to silver grey, their living roofs have become nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape, but their basic structure remains sound. Meanwhile, more advanced buildings from the same period have long since collapsed, victims of rigid designs that fought against natural forces rather than working with them, of materials that failed when not constantly maintained, of approaches that sought to create perfect barriers rather than breathable systems. This pattern continues into modern times. Today's high-end log homes, with their perfectly milled logs, their engineered notches, their synthetic chinking, often begin to fail within just a few years of construction. Water becomes trapped in seemingly minor imperfections. Mold develops in supposedly sealed spaces. Logs crack and split as they continue to dry after construction. Your brand new $1 million log home is rotting, as one restoration expert bluntly puts it. Despite all our modern technology, despite computerized design and specialized materials, we've created structures less durable than those built by primitive mountain men, with nothing but axes and determination. The contrast becomes most apparent when modern builders attempt to restore original trapper tilts. Their first instinct is often to correct what they see as flaws, to replace top notches with bottom ones, to seal the breathable chinking with modern compounds, to cover the living roof with conventional materials. These old-timers didn't know what they were doing, a contractor told a cabin owner in Idaho. We need to fix these mistakes, or the whole thing will collapse. Yet, when the mistakes are preserved instead, when the original techniques are understood and respected, these structures continue to function as designed, often outlasting nearby modern construction. The few preservation specialists who truly understand mountain building techniques view them with increasing respect. They've learned through experience that these primitive approaches often outperform modern alternatives in certain conditions. The breathable walls manage moisture better than sealed ones. The living roofs provide superior insulation and longevity. The flexible construction accommodates natural movement rather than fighting it. They weren't just making do with what they had, explains one cabin restoration expert. They were developing sophisticated systems perfectly adapted to their environment. We're only now beginning to understand how advanced some of these techniques really were. This re-evaluation parallels a broader shift in modern building philosophy. After decades of creating increasingly sealed, mechanically controlled environments, some architects and builders are rediscovering the value of working with natural forces rather than against them. Concepts like breathable wall systems, living roofs, natural thermal management and local material use, all central to mountain man construction, are being incorporated into cutting-edge sustainable design. The most sophisticated approach isn't always the most complex, notes a professor of sustainable architecture. Sometimes it's about finding the elegant simplicity that works with natural processes instead of trying to overpower them. In this sense, the mountain man's building wisdom was ahead of its time, or perhaps outside of time altogether. It represented an approach to shelter that didn't fight against the environment, but worked in harmony with it, that didn't require constant technological intervention, but functioned through passive natural processes. The contrast with modern construction couldn't be more stark. Today's buildings often require complex mechanical systems just to remain habitable. Heating, cooling, ventilation, humidity control. When these systems fail, the structures themselves can quickly become uninhabitable or even begin to deteriorate. The trapper's tilt, by contrast, functioned entirely through passive design. Its breathable walls, its living roof, its thermal mass floor, its orientation to the sun. It required no external energy input to manage temperature and moisture. It adapted to changing conditions rather than trying to maintain an artificial environment regardless of external forces. In the mountains of Montana, a small but growing movement of enthusiasts has begun to rediscover and preserve mountain man building techniques. They study original structures where they can find them, experiment with traditional materials and methods, and document their findings for future generations. It's not about rejecting modern technology, explains one such enthusiast. It's about recognizing that sometimes older approaches solved problems in ways we've forgotten. There's wisdom there that deserves to be preserved. These modern experimenters face significant challenges. Building codes rarely accommodate traditional techniques like living roofs or breathable walls. Materials like properly harvested bark shingles are difficult to source. The hands-on skills required for effective top-notching or proper chinking preparation are not easily learned from books. Yet their efforts represent an important recovery of nearly lost knowledge, practical wisdom developed through generations of harsh trial and error in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Imagine a contemporary cabin site in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho. A small group of builders is constructing a trapper's tilt using traditional methods, top-notched logs with the bark left on, a living roof system of poles, bark and sod, breathable chinking made from clay, sand and plant fibres. They're not historical reenactors seeking perfect authenticity. They use modern tools alongside traditional ones, incorporate certain contemporary materials where appropriate, and document their work with digital technology. But the core principles remain the same. Building with local materials in ways that breathe, adapt, and work with natural forces rather than against them. Their finished structure would be recognizable to a mountain man from 1830, though perhaps cleaner and more precisely executed. More importantly, it embodies the same philosophical approach to shelter, not as a rigid barrier against nature, but as a living system that participates in natural cycles. This approach has potential applications beyond historical interest. In a world facing climate change and resource constraints, building methods that require minimal external energy, use local materials, and last for generations without major maintenance have obvious advantages. The mountain man's solutions to shelter in extreme environments might offer valuable insights for our own uncertain future. The wisdom embodied in the trapper's tilt wasn't limited to specific techniques like top-notching or living roofs. It represented a broader philosophy of building and living, one that acknowledged the power of natural forces and sought to work with them rather than against them, that valued adaptability over rigid resistance, that recognized the intelligence embedded in traditional practices. As evening falls on our imagined modern cabin site, the builders sit around a fire much as mountain men did nearly 2 centuries earlier. They discuss what worked well and what didn't, share innovations and adaptations, pass knowledge through direct demonstration and hands-on practice. The methods of transmission may be different, but the essential process remains the same. Practical wisdom refined through experience and shared through community. In this small way, the forgotten knowledge of the mountain men lives on, not as a historical curiosity, but as a living tradition with continuing relevance. The specific techniques may evolve and adapt to new materials and tools, but the core principles remain. Build with what's available, work with natural forces rather than against them, create systems that breathe and adapt rather than rigid structures that fight inevitable change. As you lie in your comfortable modern bed, far removed from the harsh realities of mountain life, there's something worth considering about these forgotten techniques. They remind us that sometimes the most sophisticated approach isn't the most complex or technologically advanced. Sometimes it's the solution that works with nature's forces rather than trying to overpower them. The mountain man's cabin wasn't just shelter, it was a philosophy embodied in logs and clay, a philosophy that acknowledged nature's power and sought harmony rather than dominance. And as modern buildings continue to fail despite increasingly complex engineering and expensive materials, perhaps it's a philosophy worth rediscovering. Those crude-looking shelters built with nothing but axes and determination, using green logs that modern builders would reject, employing techniques that contemporary experts would consider backwards, outlasted nearly everything else constructed in their era. They worked because they weren't fighting against the environment but adapting to it, because they weren't sealed away from nature but in constant conversation with it. In this balance, this harmony between human needs and natural forces, lies the true wisdom of the mountain man's approach to shelter. It's a wisdom we largely forgot in our rush toward technological solutions, but one that may offer valuable lessons for building resilient, sustainable structures in an uncertain future. The top notch, the green logs, the living roof, the breathable chinking, separate they might seem primitive or flawed, together they formed one of the most sophisticated shelter systems ever devised for extreme environments, one that could be built quickly with minimal tools, adapt to changing conditions, and last for generations with minimal maintenance. As sleep approaches and your thoughts drift, consider that sometimes the best solutions aren't about conquering nature, but working alongside it, not about creating perfect barriers, but systems that breathe and adapt. The mountain man understood this through hard-won experience. Perhaps we're beginning to remember what they knew all along. Your bed is soft, your room temperature perfectly controlled, your shelter built with technologies the mountain men could never have imagined. Yet there's something to be learned from those simple cabins that stood for centuries while our modern structures often fail within decades. In that lesson, that harmony sometimes outperforms dominance, that flexibility often outlasts rigidity, that working with natural forces can be more effective than fighting against them, lies wisdom that transcends specific building techniques. It's a perspective that applies not just to construction, but to how we approach challenges of all kinds. As you drift towards sleep, comfortable and secure, perhaps carry with you this final thought from the forgotten knowledge of the mountain men. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution isn't the most complex, but the one that works in harmony with the world around it, rather than in opposition to it. And in that spirit of harmony, of gentle adaptation rather than rigid resistance, allow yourself to drift peacefully into sleep like a well-built cabin, settling comfortably into the landscape around it, breathing with the night air at home in its environment.